Salve, year threes and year fours.
So a very big welcome once again to the year threes and fours of the Eton Porny school, our friends at the Eton Wick school, and indeed to all those joining us for the very first time. I very much hope your family is doing well and staying safe in these rather unsettling times of lockdown, but I'm sure you are no doubt looking forward to continuing learning some Latin and discovering some new things about the ancient world. Fortunately, Tiberius and I, Philippus, are back again virtually to talk to you about a particular favorite topic of ours, and I think of yours too: warfare, fighting, and heroes. So I'll hand over the virtual mic to Tiberius without further ado, who will introduce what exactly we have in store for you today.
Yeah, guys, we've got lots of exciting stuff to talk to you about today. We've decided, the topic for this week that we've decided on is Greek and Roman warfare. So we're lucky enough to have Philippus talking us through some elements of Greek warfare, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Roman warfare. And at the end of today's session, we'll also do some Latin language work, building on top of what we did last week. So we've got lots of really exciting stuff, and yeah, we hope you enjoy. Back to you, Philippus.
Perfect. So we have a PowerPoint in store for you, and essentially what I like to do is give you a whistle-stop tour of all the Greek warfare, which happens in the course of about 500 years or so. And I'll try to tell you how the Greeks fought, how it all started, what were the most exciting battles that ever happened in Greek history. So if you get the PowerPoint up, I will do that. So where do we start when we think about Greek warfare? Well, here's the PowerPoint. We tend to start with the world of heroes, myth, fantasy, and particularly the world of the Trojan War, which some of you might know. Some of you might have read in Homer's Iliad. Homer, the Greek ancient poet, about 3,000 years old to this day. And what he describes in the Trojan War is a scene where the very best men of Greece and the very best men of the Trojans come together in a clash, and they fight it out. And what's different about this world of heroes and warfare is that the warriors want to fight to gain glory and to try and establish a legacy for themselves. So they're not really fighting for, they are kind of fighting for their own side, but what they're really fighting for is themselves and trying to be the very best on the battlefield. And so this is a particular, what you see on my screen on the PowerPoint is just a particular fragment of a piece of pottery from ancient Greece, which shows on the left Achilles, the best fighter of the Greeks, and on the right, Hector, the best fighter of the Trojans. And spoiler alert, the Greeks win and Achilles kills Hector. But these are the very best, heroes in the Trojan War and in this world of myth or fantasy. We don't think this existed, but we certainly like to when we read the account given by Homer in his Iliad. And I've got a little video for you, which is the trailer to an British Museum's exhibition on Troy. You might have been to it, but if you haven't, here's a little snippet of what the Trojan War really felt like. So exciting. That was the trailer to the British Museum's exhibition on Troy. And what you probably saw was the Trojan horse and all those parts of the myth, but we'll save that for another time. I'm sure, save it for another special. So where do we go on from this? Well, give or take another 500 years, we come to about 700 BC in ancient Greece. And we, instead of getting the heroic fighter, we get the very ordinary man, the farmer, because in ancient Greece, what people did for a living was they farmed and they fought quite a lot. So in the next slide I've got for you, here's a little map. And this is what ancient Greece looked like. Ancient Greece was not one big country. It was compared to our standards today, it was a collection of about 1,000 city-states, which are smaller districts, if you like. So each little dot you can see on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side of the Aegean Sea, which is the main sea kind of the Empire of Greece, are little city-states. And in the boxes, you can see names which are the heroes who come from these particular city-states. And so what all these men in the city-states did was they farmed and they fought, because the ancient Greeks liked to fight against each other. It was a kind of civil war, if you could call it a civil war. And when your city-state required you to fight, you would have to fight with whatever tools you had. You might have picked up your battle axe, and you might have picked up, if you were lucky, you might have had a javelin. But for most people who were poor, they basically used whatever tools they could to fight. And you can imagine it was a rather bloody and brutal way of life, and many people got killed. But that, for the next 500 years, was the way of life. Greeks fought against each other, and the consequences were bloody. So in the next about 300 years, we get a development. So we're not just thinking about farmers fighting. We get an advancement of the way of fighting by way of the Greeks. And we get a more sophisticated type of fighter. This is the hoplite fighter. You can see from these rather amusing photographs, images. They're not real. They're just kind of approximations of what we think these people look like. So what makes a hoplite fighter unique? Well, he has a round, big, strong shield, which he would have used to great effect to defend himself, but also would have used to defend the person on his side. And I'll explain how that works. He had a very long javelin, which was about 6 to 10 feet long, so about maybe 2 or 3 meters long. And you can maybe see that he has a sword. For if his spear broke, then he would use his sword as a last resort to kind of jab at the opponent and to cause quite a lot of damage there. They all wear helmets, quite unique, finely wrought helmets. You might remember we talked about the Gorgon Medusa last time in our video. Well, they might have had on their shields, like the man on the right, pictures of a Gorgon Medusa or of a particularly scary person to frighten the enemy. So these are particularly scary fighters. Their name hoplite comes from the word hoplon in Greek, which is the shield that they used. And these are heavily armed fighters. They've got all the heavy artillery that and all the that you need as a fighter to stand out. And the focus here, compared to the Iliad and the Trojan War, is that you're really fighting for your country. You're fighting for your city-state, I should say, and you're doing this in a very effective manner. Here we've got a vase which is called the Chigi vase, and that comes from this vase is about 650 BC. So this is the earliest depiction we have of the hoplites, which you can see on the vase. And we think that the hoplites basically came around from about 600, 700 BC. And this was found in a tombstone in Italy quite recently. So how did these hoplites fight? Well, they fought in formations called the phalanx, which is obviously a Greek word. And it relied on each soldier being very tightly packed, to the other person. You can see that, you can see, I think from the image on the bottom left, that each hoplite soldier had a shield to the left of him, so he could protect the hoplite to his left, and each hoplite would do that, so you'd get a kind of interlacing effect. And the whole phalanx relied upon the fact that every man would help and defend the man on his left and on his right. But if there was a gap of weakness in the phalanx, then that could be particularly deadly and devastating. So what the phalanx relied upon was men standing firm, marching together, and not giving way. And usually these phalanxes would be about 8 to 12 men deep, and basically as wide as you could manage, because the phalanx, if there were two phalanxes fighting against one another, this is basically what happens when Greeks fight each other, phalanx versus a phalanx. The phalanx with the widest line tends to be at an advantage, because it can encircle the other phalanx and cause considerable damage from the sides. So this is the way of fighting, and Tiberius will describe how this is very much different from the Roman way of fighting. A very good example of hoplite warfare is seen through Sparta. Many of you probably know Sparta and what kind of warriors they produced. They were the very best of their kind. They were the most fierce. Those strange letters that you can see on their shields, a kind of upside down V, is actually a Greek letter, a lambda, which stands for Lakedaimonioi, which in Greek means a Spartan. So they're all fighting for Sparta. And what distinguishes Sparta from all the other Greek city-states is that they were the very best fighters. And the reason they were such good fighters is because they trained children from about your age, year 3s and year 4s, to fight for their city-states. So if you're about 9 or if you're about 10, you would be trained to become a fighter, and you would fight for your country, you would fight for your city-states. And the Spartans would never give up, they would never retreat. In the same way, in a war, you might get shot if you retreat. In Sparta, you would certainly get killed or impaled in a javelin by your own men if you retreated. So you always had to stay together, and the Spartans were particularly effective, and that's why they won so many battles. And you can just see on the left, for example, these are their spears extended at full reach, and they're particularly useful for jabbing at the opponents from a distance. So we get a particularly good example of how the Spartans fought from the Battle of Thermopylae, which you might know, but I can give a bit of context. This happened in about 480 BC. It was part of the Persian Wars, the Greco-Persian Wars. So Persians fought Greeks. And in the Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans, who were only a force of about 300, managed to kill, although they all got wiped out, the 300 Spartans, they managed to inflict damage and kill 20,000 Persians, which is an incredible achievement. That just really shows that the Spartans, fought to the end. They were the kind of the underdog, but they would never give up, and they risked their lives for the greater good of their land. So I think they provide a particularly inspiring message to us nowadays, but never to give up, always to fight to the last. And we've got an interesting video actually to show to you at the end, but if you just hold on a little bit, we can get there. You can maybe see from the map that Thermopylae is the bit circled in black. And what was special about Thermopylae is there was a very narrow pass, and you'll see on the video that the Spartans managed to use that effectively. So they didn't get outflanked by the 20,000 Persians. They managed to fight in the narrow pass, and that's why they were so effective at destroying so many more Persians than their own number. The next type of warfare is naval warfare, and this peculiar boat, which you can see here, is known as a trireme. Triremes were boats with 3 decks of oars, hence the word tri, which means 3 in Greek. And they were the very best ships of their kind. They were particularly used by the Athenians. So the Spartans were very good on land. The Athenians were very good on water. And they've got, they're in much the same way that you might design your shields or your armor. They design their boats. You get the eye in the very front of the trireme for a sense of good luck, and you get a battering ram in the front, which is very effective to your opposing fleets. A good example of these triremes being put to use is in the Battle of Salamis, which was just a month later than the Battle of Thermopylae. It's the same war, Greeks versus Spartans, but this time it happened in Salamis. From the map you can see it's kind of towards the bottom. It's an island off the coast of Athens, and the Athenians had 40 ships, only 40 ships, and they managed to, they got wiped out by the considerably larger Persian force, but they managed to ruin 300 Persian ships. So that just shows how much superior the Athenians were to the Persians, and all because that they had a very effective way of fighting naval warfare through the trireme. That goes to show that the Spartans very best of their kind on land, the Athenians very best of their kind on water, and they embodied the very best type fighting spirit of the Greeks. And interestingly, these two forces, Spartans and Greeks, came together. They clashed in a war called the Peloponnesian War, which lasted about 27 years, happened about 431 to 404 BC, so about half a century later. I won't go into it in too much detail, but essentially there was a clash between these two forces, and actually the Spartans won. So the Spartans were the most superior out of these two, out of the main superpowers of Greece. But in the same way that the Athenians lost against the Spartans too lost in a later battle, and that was against the Thebans. So every great city-state achieves their height in terms of warfare. But as with empires, for example, they all fall at some point. You can't be the best forever, and this is what Athens and Sparta shows us through history. So those were two main battles in the Greek world. Before I just transition to Tiberius, here's an interesting example of Greeks fighting Romans. We don't really get very many accounts of Greeks fighting Romans because there are different parts of the timeline. A good amount, maybe 100, 200 years separates the two civilizations. But the closest we get to a Greek versus Roman battle, where the Romans won, unfortunately, the Greeks no longer the force they used to be, was in the Achaean War. The Achaean War consisted of the Achaeans. You can see from the map, it's the red part. This was a kind of alliance of Greek states, Corinth, Athens, all these other important states you can see in red, in the kind of shaded red region, and they fought against the Romans, and unfortunately they weren't successful enough, and the Romans beat them. And Tiberius would explain why the Romans generally were able to beat the Greeks, and that was through a different type of warfare. So the hoplite warfare was useful back, in the 500 BC, that kind of region, and before, but there are always new types of warfare getting developed, and you have to basically keep in change with the times. So I think I've got, there's a picture on the top right which shows the difference between legions and phalanxes. Tiberius would explain, but main difference, hoplites use their big jutting out spears in a very effective way.
Thank you very much, Philippus, for that fascinating talk about Greek warfare. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about Roman warfare and talk you through the organization, the different ranks in the Roman army, and some of their tactics. So first things first, this was what the Roman Empire looks like in 117 AD. So this was the peak of the Roman Empire, the biggest it had ever got. It spread from Spain, modern day Spain in the west, to Mesopotamia in the east, which is modern day Iraq, and from Hadrian's Wall up here in Britain, all the way down to Egypt in the south. So it was a massive empire, and the Roman army played a big role in, firstly, the expansion of the Roman Empire, so actually acquiring these lands, but also in maintaining the lands and keeping the empire under control. So it was really important that Rome had a functioning and efficient army. So we're going to look first at what the Roman legion looks like. I'm going to skip on a few slides to show you an overview. But yes, here. So the legion was made up of around 5,500 soldiers. So it was a massive number of soldiers in a legion. And if I go back, we'll look at it in more detail. So one centurion, this is what a centurion roughly would have looked like. I mean, obviously not exactly like this. This is a cartoon, but he was in charge of 80 men in total. And that's what made up a Roman century. So he was in charge of 80 soldiers, and that was his job. And 6 of these groups of 80, so 6 centuries, made up one cohort. And 10 of these cohorts made up one legion. And then attached to the legion was often around 120 cavalrymen. So it was a very intimidating and strong force, the Roman legion. You can see here we've got the cavalry, 10 cohorts. Here you've got some additional light troops and reserves, and the legend down here just explains the diagram and who's where. But let's have a little look at, more specifically, an archetypal, so an example of a Roman legionary who made up the Roman legion. So what would he have had to fight with? What weapons would he have had? Well, he would have had a gladius, which is a sword here, a pilum or a hasto, which is a spear, and potentially a pugio, which is a dagger. In terms of equipment and defensive materials, he would have had a scutum, which is a shield, a galea, which is a helmet, and in terms of clothing, a tunica. They sometimes, because the Roman Empire was so big, they often would go into northern parts of Europe where it was much colder than in Rome and in southern Europe. And so sometimes they wore what they called braccae, which is what we would call trousers. So their everyday clothing depended on where they were stationed throughout the empire. But a tunica and a tunic is a very common bit of clothing that they would have been wearing. And yeah, we're going to look a little bit at some of their tactics. So if you remember from what Philippus was telling us, in Greek warfare, they had, the hoplites had a circular shield. And actually, if we look here, a big difference is that Romans had these rectangular curved shields, and these proved particularly useful when they were forming this particular formation, the testudo or tortoise formation, which this diagram is in. That's the formation there, and they would hold up their shields above their heads and in front of them, so that any arrows that the opposition would fire at them would just land into these shields, and they were protected from all, well, not on the sides, but that wasn't so much of a worry because it was quite hard for the opposition to get them there, but they were protected a lot by their shields. So this was a really, really important tactic that the Romans used, and is a very famous part of their excellent warfare and tactics. Another tactic that they had was the wedge formation, which they would which they would go into, and they would be trained really, really well so that their centurion or the centurion of the first cohort, who was the main leader of the whole legion, they would simply have to call out wedge formation in Latin, obviously, and they would be trained to get into this position really rapidly and intimidate the enemy. And the wedge formation enabled the legion to really infiltrate into the opposition. If you imagine having a sharp pencil, that's what the wedge formation was like. You can really do some damage with it. So this was a really important tactic, and the Romans reaped the rewards of using it. Finally, a final tactic is what they called it Greek fire, which is a little bit misleading because the Romans actually invented it, and it wasn't the Greeks. But this was particularly useful when they were fighting naval battles. So what the Greek fire was able to burn on water, which made it very, very difficult and put the enemy in a very bad and harmful situation, and it was very lethal in naval battles. So finally, I've got a little video for you on an average day in the life of a Roman soldier. So we'll start watching this.
The year is 15 CE, and the Roman Empire is prospering. Most of the credit will go to the emperor, but this success wouldn't have been possible without loyal soldiers like Servius Felix. Servius enlisted as a legionary 8 years ago at age 18, the son of a poor farmer with few prospects. Unlike the majority of legionaries, he doesn't gamble, so he's been able to save most of his wages. He's even kept his viaticum, the 3 gold coins he received when he enlisted. If he survives until retirement, he'll receive several acres of land, and he's grown rather fond of a girl back home whom he intends to marry. But he'll have to wait until he completes his 25 years of service before that can happen. And the life of a legionary is dangerous and grueling. Today, Servius's legion, along with 3 others, has undertaken a great march of 30,000 Roman paces, the equivalent of nearly 36 kilometers. Servius's armor and weapons, including his gladius, scutum, and 2 pila, weigh over 20 kilograms. And that's not counting his backpack, or sarcina, which contains food and all the tools he needs to help build the camp: spade, saw, pickaxe, and basket. Although Servius is exhausted, he won't sleep much tonight. He's been assigned the first watch, which means looking after the baggage animals and keeping alert against a possible ambush. After he's done, he lies awake, dreading the day ahead, which will force him to recall his worst nightmare. At dawn, Servius eats breakfast with his 7 tent companions. They're like a family, all bearing scars from the battles they've fought together. Servius is from Italia, but his fellow soldiers hail from all over the empire, which stretches from Syria to Spain. So they're all far from home in the northern land of Germania. Servius's legion and 3 others with him today are under the command of Emperor Tiberius's nephew, Germanicus, named for his father's military successes against the Germanic tribes. Each legion has close to 5,000 men, divided into cohorts of about 500, further subdivided into centuries of around 80 to 100 men. Each century is commanded by a centurion. An aquilifer, or eagle bearer, marches at the head of each legion, carrying its eagle standard. The centurions march beside the legionaries, belting out orders: dex, sin, right, left, starting with the right foot, as the left is considered unlucky or sinister. Despite the strict discipline, there's tension in the air. Last year, some legions in the area revolted, demanding better pay and a cut in the length of service. Only their general's charisma and negotiating skills prevented wholesale mutiny. Today is a just march, only 30 kilometers. As the marshes and forests of Germania lie beyond the empire's road system, the men must build causeways and bridges to make headway, something they've recently spent more time doing than fighting. Finally, they arrive at their destination, a place Servius knows too well. It's a clearing on the outskirts of the Teutoburg forest, where 6 years ago, during the reign of the Emperor Augustus, Germanic tribes under their chieftain Arminius ambushed and destroyed 3 legions. Proceeding along a narrow path, the legions were attacked from forest cover under torrential rain, with their escape blocked. It was one of the worst defeats the Romans ever suffered, and Augustus never lived it down. Servius was one of the few survivors. Servius still has nightmares of his comrades lying where they fell. But now the army is back to bury the dead with full military honors. As he helps in the task, he can't help wondering whether the bones he handles belonged to someone he knew. Several times he wants to weep aloud, but he pushes on with the task. The glory of the empire can go to the crows. All he craves is to retire on a small farm with his wife-to-be, if the gods should spare his life for 17 more years. If you want to learn more about the hopes, dreams, and daily trials of...
So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed that video. That's just to give you an insight into the average day in the life of a Roman soldier. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. That's the end of the slideshow. So I'm going to stop sharing here. And I think we're going to move on now to, if we've got time, to do just a couple of the Latin sentences, and hopefully you guys will be able to do the others by yourself. So I'm just going to get my iPad screen up. Right, so it's exactly the same as last week in terms of the setup. We've got the sentences here and the vocab below, and also the answers, but try and have a go at the sentences before you look at the answers. But let's just do 1 and 2 together, and then we'll leave you to the others. And we've also created another word search for you to do if you liked last week's and want to do another word search this week is obviously with Latin words for Greek and Roman weaponry and warfare. Okay, so let's look at number 1 here. Miles gladium habet. So as with last week, we start with we identify our subject as being the first word in the sentence, which is miles, and the last word is our main verb. So subject, verb, and the only word left has to be our object, gladium. Now that we've worked out, this is a fancy word, but this is called the syntax of the sentence. Now that we've worked out the syntax of this sentence, we just need to work out what the vocab means. Miles means soldier. Gladius, as we looked at in our PowerPoints, means sword. And habeo means I have. So now that we know the vocab, we can fully translate the sentence. Let's start with our subject. A soldier. Go to our verb. Habet is from habeo, I have, but it's referring back to the soldier. So a soldier has a sword. Is what number 1 means. Number 2, we've got miles as our subject again, optat as our verb. I'll quickly write that in for you. Hastem eus is all that's left. But before we worry too much about having 2 potential objects here, let's look at what the vocab. Miles we know means soldier. Hastem, oh sorry, that just spotted a mistake on my behalf. That should be hastam, sorry. I clicked, that's a typo from myself. But that should be hastam. And that comes from hasta, meaning spear. Optat is from opto, I choose here. And eus means his or her. So we'll start with our subject again. A soldier. Go to our verb. Chooses his or her spear. Technically, this is a fun fact, but there weren't actually any women in the Roman army. So if we're talking about Roman times, it would have been, we would know to translate it as his spear, but in modern times, talking about a soldier could be his or her. So yeah, hopefully you guys can have a go at the last 2 there. And if you do get stuck, just go and look at the answers below, but see if you can have a go at those. We'd be really impressed. And yeah, we hope you enjoy translating. So I'm going to hand back to Philippus now to round off the session for today.
Thank you very much, Tiberius. That was fascinating. From Greek warfare to Roman warfare, and to a few sentences so that you can write like the Roman authors would have written, because they tend to write quite a lot about warfare. So we'd like you to try and recognize, how they might write too. So if you have any comments about what you'd like us to cover in the future sessions, do let us know. Alternatively, if you liked Greek and Roman warfare, we would encourage you maybe to do some creative tasks. If you wanted to draw us a picture of your ideal Roman soldier or your Greek soldier, what would your army look like? What weapons would they carry? And if you wanted to draw a map and potentially research some battles they might have fought, then do that too. And we'd be really interested to see your drawings, because we know all the work that you've done over the course of the last few months. So we're very excited to see what you can do for us. So I think that's all for us. Tiberius and I would like to wish you all very well until next week. So that's Vale from me.
Yeah, Valete omnes. Hope you guys enjoyed this week, and we'll be back next week with some more classics. So yeah, have a nice week. See you next time.
Valete.
Valete.